now, as promised, the news in detail. Our top story, of course, coming out of the Qatari capital, Doha, where delegates representing the Taliban and Kabul have pledged to follow a roadmap for peace based on a monitored peace process. U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad says peace talks with the Taliban will resume today after a pause for the talks. In a joint statement after the first intra-Afghan dialogue in Doha, the Taliban and Kabul delegates agreed to reduce violence in Afghanistan. The statement includes a commitment to a monitored peace process, the return of internally displaced people, and regional non-interference in Afghanistan. U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad expressed satisfaction with the participants for finding common ground. He said the dialogue gives hope for an end to the 40-year war. Around 70 delegates took part in the two-day dialogue. For more on that, we're joined now from Kabul by Afghan affairs expert, Mr. Hamdallah Hamdard. Thank you for joining us, Hamdallah. Well, as you know, Hamdallah, both the Afghan government and Taliban, as I said, have agreed to reduce violence in Afghanistan and to follow a roadmap for peace. How has progress at these intra-Afghan talks in Doha been received there at home in Kabul and the rest of Afghanistan?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. We Afghans here in Afghanistan are hopeful for the current peace talks going on in Doha, Qatar, between the Taliban and the Afghan delegation. However, the war or the violence has not reduced yet. We witnessed very barbaric and fatal explosions both in Kabul, in Ghazni, and then there were some bombardment in Maidan Wardak province by the government and by the NATO forces as well. So both sides are continuing the war, and at the same time they are talking with each other in Doha. We hope, and definitely the nation hopes that Taliban and the government both will also reduce the violence against each other. Especially they will focus on reducing the civilian casualties, which is increasing day by day in their war. So far, there is nothing that can be felt here in Afghanistan, but we are hopeful. The progress that has been made between the two sides during the intra-Afghan peace talks in Doha, that is something that makes us hopeful towards sealing a peace deal between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and that will be monitored by the international community, especially the US and the neighboring countries.
You know, Hamdallah, you spoke there of violence in the country, but are Afghans such as yourself convinced by the Taliban's promises to respect people's rights as well, especially those of women?
Well, as long as they do not implement it practically, we cannot trust anybody. But as we are going towards the peace deal, we want to be more flexible, and we can put a trust on them at the moment. However, their past experience and even their current experience in the provinces which are dominated by them, women are not allowed to go to schools, and they are not allowed to practice and entertain their basic rights where they are governed by the Taliban. However, we hope that once they join the Afghan government and they agree on a peace deal, the women's right will be preserved, and the minorities' right will be preserved as well. And beside that, we will have our civil rights, and we definitely look forward to Taliban's acceptance of the civil rights for all the Afghans, the civil rights that are given to us by the Sharia, and also the civil rights that is practiced in all Islamic countries.
Alhamdulillah, and as a final thought, then the peace talks between the Taliban and the U.S. are resuming today itself. What are you hearing about that? How close are they to striking some sort of a deal?
Taliban have almost agreed with the U.S. regarding the U.S. forces withdrawal from Afghanistan. And they have almost agreed on that. The final declaration will be issued sooner, after a couple of days. However, the Taliban, with the Afghan delegation and even with the US, still have not agreed on a ceasefire, which is very necessary for the Afghan nation and for the people here who are victims of this Taliban and government and Taliban and US war in Afghanistan. We also look forward to Taliban and US sealing a deal on the ceasefire as well. Of course, the US government is trying to seal a political deal with the Taliban and the Afghan government before September 2019. In September, we will have the presidential polls, presidential elections in Afghanistan, and they will definitely be trying to reach at least the preliminary agreements on this kind of issues such as ceasefire, the government type, and the withdrawal of the international forces from Afghanistan. And the issues that they also discussed with the Afghan delegation, there were some minor issues, not minor, but not the issues regarding the war. They were the rights of minorities, the women's rights, the children's rights, and these things. So we hope that Taliban will reach an agreement with the US first regarding the withdrawal of the international forces, and then they will agree with the Afghan government to sign the peace deal and finally put their guns down and live their civil life with all the Afghans together.
Alhamdulillah, we'll leave there at that, but of course we do appreciate you speaking to us and sharing your insight with us here at Indus News. Let's move on now to Iraq, where 3 more ISIS militants have been killed during a major US-led anti-terror offensive in central and northern Iraq. Officials say the forces continued their advance for a second successive day, destroying militia positions and weapons. Iraqi soldiers backed by US air power have pushed into the provinces of Nineveh, Salahuddin and Anbar in pursuit of ISIS militants. Gunship helicopters destroyed a vehicle in Nineveh province, killing 3 ISIS fighters. In Salahuddin, troops found 4 car bomb making sites and seized over 30 Katyusha rockets. Elsewhere, the Saudi-led military coalition in Yemen says it has intercepted more drones launched by Houthi rebels at civilian targets in the kingdom. The rebels, though, denied targeting civilians, saying they attacked the Abha city airport and a power plant with their bomb-laden unmanned flying vehicles. The rebels have increased the use of drones to target southern Saudi Arabia over the past month. Earlier, the Saudi-led coalition claimed it foiled a Houthi attack on a commercial ship in the Red Sea. The Houthis denied launching any such attack. Well, the UN nuclear agency has confirmed that Iran has begun enriching uranium beyond a limit set by the 2015 nuclear deal. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence says Washington doesn't want war with Iran, but is ready to protect its interests. Offering to talk to Tehran on the nuclear program, Pence says Iran should not confuse American restraint with a lack of resolve. He says the 2015 nuclear deal was disastrous and there will be no more pallets of cash for Iran. Iran says world powers will not negotiate a better deal than the 2015 nuclear accord. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif says global powers must uphold their commitments under the deal if they want Tehran to return to the agreement. 23 U.S. governors have joined California in opposing U.S. President Donald Trump's plans to relax vehicle mileage standards. Trump plans to roll back tough fuel economy standards imposed by former President Barack Obama. These measures were aimed at greening the U.S. transportation sector, which accounts for 1/3 of carbon dioxide emissions. Trump has backtracked on many policies the Obama administration put in place to fight global warming. He withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord in June 2017. Trump called the accord unfair, ineffective, and very expensive. In other news, China has told the U.S. to withdraw a potential $2.2 billion arms sale to Taiwan, saying it strongly opposes the action. The deal includes over 100 tanks and 250 Stinger missiles. Beijing has previously expressed serious concern about the potential sale. The U.S. Congress has been notified about the arms deal and has 30 days to object to the sale. Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam says an extradition bill that sparked mass protests is dead. Lam, though, has not completely withdrawn the proposed legislation on moving suspects to mainland China. Protesters promised new rallies demanding a complete withdrawal of the controversial bill. Addressing a press conference, Lam admitted there are lingering doubts about the legislation. She said she would hold an open dialogue with the youth of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, OPEC has called for a quick resolution of tensions among Venezuela, Iran, and the U.S. In an interview, OPEC Secretary General Mohammad Barkindo said the world needs peace and stability to ensure growth and development. He said Iran and Venezuela will remain exempt from OPEC production quotas. The European Union has expressed grave concern over Turkey's deployment of a second ship to drill for natural gas off the coast of Cyprus. It says the operation off northeast Cyprus is an unacceptable escalation, violating Cypriot sovereignty. The EU's top diplomat, Federica Mogherini, says the European Council is considering appropriate measures against Turkey. Cyprus has been divided since Turkish forces intervened in 1974 to prevent a union with Greece and to protect the ethnic Turkish minority. Tensions flared last month between Ankara and Nicosia after a Turkish ship dropped anchor near the Mediterranean island to drill for gas. Turkey disputes the right of the Cypriot government to exploit gas reserves and sent the ships to reinforce its claim. Turkish police have begun nationwide raids, to arrest over 200 military personnel. The officials said suspects have ties with the group blamed for the 2016 coup attempt. Prosecutors said they issued arrest warrants for 228 suspects, including a colonel, 5 majors, and 100 lieutenants. They said the suspects have alleged links to the Muslim preacher Fethullah Gulen's movement. I'll be back after a short break with more news. Stay tuned for that. Begin this segment of the news bulletin in South Korea, which says it will begin hiking tours on a trail in the demilitarized zone. One of the world's most heavily fortified borders, the DMZ, is about 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide. South Korean authorities say group tours near the eastern coastal town of Goseong are expected to begin on July 23rd. Up to 40 people will be allowed per trip. The tour will include a visit to a museum on the DMZ. The project is part of South Korea's attempts to improve inter-Korean peace and stability in the peninsula. The announcement comes after U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met in the DMZ on June 30th. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, meanwhile, has offered to hold talks with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. In the meantime, senior EU officials have pledged more aid for the East European country. President Zelensky has proposed discussing Russian-annexed Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine with separatists. The Ukrainian leader has called on world powers to mediate. Moscow, though, is yet to respond to the offer. European Union leaders Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker have pledged financial assistance to conflict-hit Ukraine. Let's move on now to news coming out of Albania, where thousands of opposition supporters have resumed protests calling on Prime Minister Edi Rama to step down. They say the country's accession to the EU may be blocked if there is no change at the top. Demonstrators in Tirana called for Rama's resignation over corruption and electoral fraud allegations. Rama, who won a second term in 2017, has dismissed concerns about election results. The opposition says Rama could jeopardize Albania's accession to the European Union. EU member states are due to make a decision on that later this year. Sticking with the EU, the bloc has announced a €72 million financial assistance package for Central Asian states. The program is part of the EU's new Central Asia strategy that it announced earlier this month. EU Commission Vice President Federica Mogherini presented the plan at a Central Asia ministerial meeting in Bishkek. It will support regional trade, counterterrorism, sustainable energy, and economic empowerment. 5 former Soviet republics and Afghanistan are the beneficiaries of the plan. The EU and its members are on track to provide over €1 billion in assistance to Central Asia over the period from 2014 to 2020. France says the Vatican has lifted the diplomatic immunity of its Paris envoy, who is under investigation for alleged sexual assault. 74-year-old Luigi Ventura is facing 4 complaints of sexual abuse. French prosecutors asked the Vatican in March to lift Ventura's immunity to investigate him. Meanwhile, the U.S. capital, Washington, D.C. has been hit by historic flash floods following record rainfall of 3.5 inches for over 2 hours. Rainwater gushed into metro stations and basements, including the White House. Fast-flowing water flooded many local roads, stranding vehicles. Rescuers on boats saved drivers stuck in their vehicles. The flooding led to electrical outages, shutting down the National Archives building and museum. The local meteorological department says the risk of flash flooding in D.C. has increased because of recent heavy rains. Mexican police have rescued 51 migrants from a truck. The migrants were discovered after an X-ray image showed people hidden in compartments inside the truck's trailer. Mexican officials say they were taken into the care of the National Migration Institute, which will process them for their possible return. Mexico is trying to curb a surge of people crossing its territory to reach the United States. In May, U.S. President Donald Trump had threatened to impose tariffs on all Mexican goods if it did not slow the flow of migrants crossing its border. On to Venezuela. Newspapers there are going digital to survive the economic slowdown. But online papers, too, are facing problems with frequent power outages and low internet access.
International Monetary Fund analysts estimate inflation in Venezuela will hit 10 million% this year. Most of the country's citizens are struggling to meet their daily needs. Even newspapers have become a luxury. Most newspaper sellers are unable to sell even 10 papers a day.
I used to sell 80 newspapers a day. Now the situation is so bad, I can hardly sell 3 or 4.
With the economy in shambles and hardly anyone buying papers, media houses no longer have the funds for printing.
We wish to keep reflecting the reality of this country. We want to keep the people informed. It is frustrating that we have been forced to do so only through digital means, because we know it will not have the same impact.
Journalists say it is not just the recent economic crisis which is to blame. In 2013, the state created a company to control newsprint. 58 newspapers have closed down since then.
El Nacional was aggravated in time, but because it was targeted as it was critical of the government attacked it from other sides. He attacked it economically, he attacked it with censorship. I have a prohibition on the National Telecommunications Commission. One of the provisions that I have from the Commission is that I cannot report anything that generates anxiety.
With no end in sight, the country may soon have no free press at all.
Whimsical and cleverly decorated sculptures of hay and straw have been put on display in France. The massive artworks have been created at France's annual contest for sculptures in the French Alps.
France's unique sculpture contest is nothing less than a challenge for the artists. The sculptors have a free choice of theme, but they have to create monumental sculptures filled and covered with straw and hay. 12 sculptors from around the world have to accomplish the task in just 5 days.
The sculptors who make sculptures has several skills for their art because they have to understand the resistance of the materials, work with the blueprints and master all of that, especially the hay and straw. They are materials which are very flexible.
Chameleon, a giant lizard constructed by a Lithuanian team, won the jury and youth audience prize. Russian's team sculpture titled The Power of the Subconscious grabbed the second spot. In the circles from a Czech team clinched the bronze medal.
You have to have improvisation and adaptation. You are given the necessary materials to make what you want, and all of the artists here are great people. And me, working here at Valor, it's my life story.
Each sculptor was given 600 kilos of hay and 400 kilograms of straw to create the massive artworks. They will remain on display throughout the summer.
Let's begin with business news now with the U.S., which has announced fresh duties on some Mexican and Chinese steel goods, alleging unfair subsidies for manufacturers. The U.S. Commerce Department says imported steel used in construction benefits from subsidies in China, Canada, and Mexico. It says the subsidies are negligible in Canada's case, so no retaliatory duties have been imposed. The action is in response to a grievance lodged in February by U.S. steel producers. U.S. customs agents will begin collecting import duties based on the subsidy rates, but the funds could be returned if officials reverse the findings. Japan, meanwhile, has rejected South Korea's call to scrap the curbs on some high-tech exports. Seoul says the move puts global supply chain of smartphones at risk. Japan's industry minister Hiroshi Seko has said that implementation of additional measures depends on Seoul's response. South Korea's President Moon Jae-in says the issue has become a concern for the world because it puts a global supply chain at risk. The sanctions were imposed after a diplomatic row over forced labor during Japan's occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Japan has threatened further restrictions, saying additional measures depend on South Korea's response. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. Now you're all caught up. Thanks very much for watching this bulletin here at Indus News.